I was laughing at your... Okay, so we're going to start off with just a brief review of information from the market revolution. You already know this, but I'm a little bit compulsive and want to tell it to you again anyway. So just briefly, we'll remember Samuel Slater, who's going to smuggle out plans for a mill from England. It's basically early corporate espionage. He brings a plan for a textile mill to the United States and establishes the world's first mill then. You'll notice that it's on a river. All of the earliest mills have to be water-powered. Steam engines still have the unfortunate habit of exploding pretty regularly. So they're going to stick with water power here. Of course, anybody know who this guy is? If I told you he invented the cotton gin, would it help? God bless 8th grade. Why do you know that? I always know the cotton gin. But anyway, probably more important than Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin is his perfection of or commercialization of the idea of interchangeable parts. Before this, any kind of mechanical device, be it a tool or a machine or a weapon, anytime it broke, any one little tiny piece of it broke, you have to take the entire machine to a specialist who would have to then custom make a part that would fit only your object. And they had to do it perfectly because there was no margin for error. If you cut the part a little bit too wide here or a little bit too round here, it would destroy your machine, right? It would rub against all the other parts the wrong way and it would cause big damage. As a result, mechanical stuff was really expensive. And you couldn't really rely on it because if anything broke, it would be weeks before you could have a new part to be fitted for the whole thing. It was just really a pretty bad deal. But Eli Whitney is going to take the idea of interchangeable parts, which was developed elsewhere in France, I think, and he's going to run with it, and he's going to focus his research around the idea of weapons. And so once he has his ideas sort of all put together, he calls together a bunch of investors, and he wants to show off what he's got, and he hands them each these really nice guns. And here's the one: I have no idea about guns, y'all. I don't even, whatever. They're nice for some reason. He hands them out to them. They're all really impressed. They, feel him and look at him and they shoot him and they're just like super excited they get to keep this gun. And he goes, okay, but I have to do the second part of my whatever. And he takes the guns away from them. He takes all the pieces apart. And then to their horror, he throws all the pieces in a giant pile and mixes them up. And they're all horrified because they think he's ruined the guns. Because if you were to get the wrong piece, if these were all custom-made guns, and you got the wrong piece and put it together, that wrong piece could cause the whole gun to break. It could cause the gun to explode when you tried to fire it because you had it in the wrong, whatever. They thought these guns were all ruined now. How could you do such a thing? And so then one by one, he takes out the pieces, like a random whatever he's got from this and a random this, and he puts them all together, fires it, it's perfect, hands it to one guy. Picks one of each part up again, puts it together, fires it, and it's work. And they're all astounded. The idea that you could mass produce a single part and have that exact same part fit every single one of whatever it is you're talking about, guns in this case, but tools, machines, whatever it was, this is a revelation because it means that machines can become more reliable. You can fix them much less expensively, and incidentally, it's pioneering the idea of mass production. Produce a whole bunch of one thing, it will cost less money, you can do it faster, and that's one of the foundational principles of an industrial economy anyway. So this is interchangeable parts, Eli Whitney. It's a really big deal in terms of our current economy and the growth from the market system. I want to briefly mention railroads. This is a picture of the Baltimore and Ohio, or the B&O Railroad, or if you were juvenile like me playing Monopoly, the B.O. Railroad. Anyway, like body odor. Okay, never mind. Anyway, so here's a Tom Thumb Railway. It was begun in 1830, but please remember, railroads are not a significant factor in the American economy until after 1840, right? They're begun in the 1830s. I think there's a railroad company in Pennsylvania that is actually begins in the 1820s. But they are so unreliable. They have, that nasty habit of exploding every now and then. They are so inefficient. They haven't figured out the right combination of fuel, the best way to get the machines moving. They are so unwieldy that each of them are made, each train is made or locomotive is made for a particular set of tracks. And each set of tracks is different, each car is different. So if you want to get, let's say I wanted to load up a car of something and attach it to a train, I'd have to custom make the car for the train I was going to attach it to. And that train can only travel along its stretch of tracks. And once it reaches another person's set of tracks, it literally can't go from one track to the other because the gauge or the width of the track is different from one company to the next. So I want you to know that railroads exist at this time, but they are not economically significant. Talking briefly about Lowell, the Lowell mill system is really one of the most famous examples of early industry in the American nation. And we know that this is a textile mill, so of course what is the first industry to be industrialized in America? That would be textiles. And we know that Lowell is unique because they're going to begin by hiring exclusively young women, right? These are farm girls primarily. They're not married yet. They're a burden to their fathers. They're going to go and work here. And Lowell was advertised as being like a finishing school for these girls, like send them here, they'll work, 8 hours a day, and then in the evenings they'll have classes about how to cook and paint and play music and read the Bible, and they're going to live in dormitories with a matron, and it's going to be wonderful. And it actually lasts like it sounds for a little while until more mills develop in competition, right? And competition, of course, will drive down prices. If prices are lower, can the Lowell system afford to have all these services and amenities for the girls? So very quickly then, Lowell becomes like a live-in factory where everybody's worked to the bone and rises before dawn and then lives in dangerous conditions. Anyway, it doesn't go that well for very long. It's also important to remember or to note that early in American industry, like when these mills are first developing, sometimes students go, ooh, this is cool. They're like letting women do real jobs. They're like defying the, expectations. No, because industry was seen at the beginning as like a lesser job. It doesn't require full body manual labor. You're just moving spindles from place to place or tending a machine. It was seen as very weak work. And so early on, sure, women can do that. That's not a real man's job. But as the economy develops, as the market revolution continues, as the market system grows and industry becomes more prominent as an economic enterprise in this country, well then, as it becomes a primary economic driver of the country, it will be seen as a man's job. And then the women who are hired are just poor women, and they're forced to work for very low wages. They're in competition with men who are going to get paid much better and get better jobs, that kind of thing. So the idea of like this being women's work is like an insult to industry. It's this idea that it was seen at this point as being lesser, less significant. This isn't a real job. This is sort of some novelty that has come up. I would like you to consider really, and again, this is a weak point in my personal historical knowledge, is this idea of like cultural change, because it's less black and white. But I think it is important to remember. Think how dramatically Americans' lifestyles have changed in the course of just 20 years, right? 1820 to 1840, we see this really revolutionary market transformation. And people go now from where previously most people completely ruled their own lives. They had a little plot of land somewhere out in the sticks, and they were able to produce all the things they needed. They all worked, they woke up together in the morning, and they had their different jobs. You go feed the pigs, you go, milk the cow, you go start pulling weeds in the garden, whatever it is. They would work in the fields together in the afternoons to gather whatever crops they could harvest for that day. They did all that together. Their lives were run by the sun, from sun up to sundown, and by whatever it was that their family needs dictated at the time. But when we move to a market system, it doesn't quite work that way, right? Because now the primary focus of our economy is going to be on outside the home. It's not like we're all working together to raise these animals and tend these different gardens. No, we're going to have one big economic enterprise, one big crop we're growing. And so the distinction between work and home becomes very strong. The idea that women are domestic people, that women should be at home, that women should not be at work, this idea develops at this time, because prior to that there wasn't really a difference between work and home. Sure, women were at home and so were men. They were all working. That's the way it went. But the distinction between work and home is going to become very strong here. And additionally, the idea of who runs your day. Are you an individual? Do you have your choices that you make and you run your own life? Or are you sort of victim to the whims of the market or to the whims of the clock? Some bell whistle rings in the morning and says, come to work, and you work until the whistle rings again, you can sit down and have lunch, and then the whistle rings again, you got to go back to work. It's a very different way of ordering your life. I mean, you guys live by the bell here in the school, and if you can imagine, if any of you have ever been homeschooled, you might understand the sort of transition, right? You go from a life in which you get to decide for yourself what your schedule will be, to a life in which everything is dictated to you. It's challenging, and it happens on a pretty wide scale across the country in the span of just a couple of decades. So the country is really reeling. And then this sort of picture, which is from the 1830s and shows this sort of idealized, household or family scene. The woman is sewing, very domestic. The father's just come in from work. Here are the lovely children, whatever it is. this idea, this gender division of labor, women are in the home and so on. I told you already that it grows as a part of this market revolution, but I'd like to encourage you to think about who gets to participate in that. What kinds of women get to be idealized in the home? Poor women? No, poor women have to work no matter what, right? Poor women are going to have to be out there in the economy. They're not fitting into these new ideas about how women should be distinct from their husbands. In this case, we're going to see now a real division between what upper class and sort of upper middle class women do and how they value their lives, and then what the rest of the world looks like, or what those who are living in poverty have to deal with. That being said, it's the market revolution that really brings to light this significant class consciousness. Not to say that there had never been different classes before. In the revolution, there were the elites and the wealthy and the poor and so on. But the market revolution and this shift to a market economy and toward industrial economy is going to really highlight the difference between the working poor and the wealthy. You've been in world history, you know a little bit about Marxism, right? The idea of valuing producerism, like the people who produce the stuff should get all the, the benefits, and if you just own money or you just own property, that shouldn't be enough to get you wealthy. This is sort of who controls the means of production and who, executes them. Whatever it is, these ideas develop at this time. There's not the same kind of class divisions prior to the rise of industrialism, because everybody is really involved in producing in some way. Even the elites, they still have a plantation, or they're running a big trading company, or whatever it is. They're still involved in the economy. But as the economy develops, now we see people who are making money off of making money, right? Bankers and financiers who are trading in capital, and that's how they get their wealth. They never produce anything. Or wealthy factory owners who simply own the means of production, and then they get wealthy off the labor of everybody else. All they have to do is just maintain ownership. And so that conflict is going to arise. So, of course, the North is going to become more commercial and industrial. The West is going to be the breadbasket of the country, but I wanted to focus on the South, because the South's job is an interesting one. It's pretty clear that the North is making manufactured stuff, nod your heads, and the West is making food, nod your heads. So why do we need the South? The answer is not we don't need them. We do need them. Why do we need the South? They're producing cotton. Where do they sell the cotton? Primarily. Well, they're beginning to sell a tiny bit of it to the North, but remember, the North's economy is really, really small so far. They're just barely developing. So most of the South's cotton is getting sold to Europe in general, England in particular, right? England had their industrial revolution back in the 1730s. So England's industry is up and running 100%. They are huge importers of American cotton. That means what is the South bringing into our country? Money, financial, foreign capital, right? They're bringing in outside wealth from other countries that will help. And remember, one of the important features of a market economy is available capital, right? So although it seems like the South isn't as well integrated into the rest of the economy, they're not trading as much with the North and the West as the North and West are trading with one another. They are really important, because we're going to get, in the days before the gold rush, where we discover vast supplies of wealth here in our own continent, most of the wealth in the world is still concentrated in Europe. They have the wealth. And so the South is bringing some of that wealth back to America through this export of cotton. But it's not all golden in the South, because as any of you who might have taken any agriculture classes, or maybe you talked to this in 8th grade, should know, growing cotton is really difficult for the soil. It depletes the soil of resources very quickly. And so, although cotton is a really strong cash crop, is the best thing for Southerners to produce in order to bring in the most income, it exhausts the soil and leads them very quickly to look westward. So this impetus to expand is going to come in a large part from these slave-holding southern states. And those southern states then are going to see conflict rise as they try to push west, but the North doesn't want the western states to be slave states. But then where do you expect us to grow this cotton, and how do you want us to get this wealth in? That conflict will really arise there. So here's a look I just wanted to show you. This is an example of a Hudson River School painting. You can see it's hazy in the background. That's a very common theme from the Hudson River School. A very wild landscape. This is not a manicured place. Here's John James Audubon in one of his paintings, in this case of the bald eagle. He's highlighting these American flora and fauna and elevating them to a more artistic style. So now let's sort of take a break and put that aside, and now think about Andrew Jackson. I don't want to, but we have to. Here we go. So before we get too much into Andrew Jackson, let's think about what's going on at the time of his election. We looked at this on Friday, some of that data, and one of the things we noticed is that political participation is going up, right? Political participation is going up. More people are getting involved, and that's made all the more remarkable because why? More people are getting involved, and more people are eligible to get involved. Why? Because property requirements are being eliminated. That's a really big deal. We're seeing the political system opening to the general public. The reason for the elimination of property requirements, by the way, is because as we open the frontier in the West, land becomes so cheap because we have so much of it, thanks Louisiana Purchase, that like the idea of a property requirement becomes ridiculous. Everybody can have property. Just go in the West and there's like a bazillion land or acres that you can just take, and so property requirements become like insignificant, so they just go away after a while. We also see, as we looked at the data on Friday, that more and more states are allowing their citizens to help choose the electors. Why do we choose electors? They vote for who? They vote for president, right? The electors are the ones that choose our president. And so states are now opening up that process of choosing the president to more and more of the people. So that's a big deal. But class divisions are growing, and you might think that that's bad. But if we all if all of us, I'm going to include you with me, sorry. Maybe some of you are super wealthy and have your own independent corporations, but probably not just yet anyway. So if we're all here, like us middle class-ish people, if we all trust and believe that the super wealthy elites have our best interests at heart, are we going to pay attention to politics and get involved? No, if we trusted them, we'd be very content to let them do all the hard work, and we don't have to pay attention or get involved or vote or whatever. But if we see these class divisions where we feel like the elites don't have any idea what it's like to be one of us, then we are more motivated to get involved, right? So class division might be seen as bad, but on the other hand, it promotes more political participation. People are getting involved. People are trying to affect the outcome of government because they think that it's important for their own well-being. They think that their voices have to be heard if they want anything good to happen. So now I have a very sad story to tell you. And I want to begin by telling you that it is complete fallacy. It's not true. It was a slanderous story made up by an angry and violent ideologue who is not fit to be president and becomes president anyway. I'm not bitter at all. Here's what happens. In 1824, we're going to have an election. And we're going to see there are 5 different candidates, and I never remember the 5th one, so I'll tell you about 4 of them. Of course, there's your friend and mine, our hero, Henry Clay. There is John Quincy Adams, the richest, elitist, literally the son of a president, like born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He is super elite. John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts. Then we've got this guy named William Crawford, who is from Georgia and is a pretty nice guy and really well liked. He eventually has a stroke, so he doesn't matter in this story, not very much anyway. And then there's Andrew Jackson. Now Jackson got some fame because he won the Battle of New Orleans. Fine, we'll give it to him. But he was really famous at this time because in 1820 he had violated international law to chase a bunch of Native Americans into northern Florida, which was, by the way, controlled by the Spanish, not by us. And while he was there, he executed 2 British citizens without any authority to do so. And then eventually the Spanish gave us Florida, and so he was hailed as a hero, despite the fact that he violated international law. He was well known for dueling people and shooting them. He could hardly read or write. He cursed on a regular basis in public. He is not a nice man. Okay, never mind. Anyway, here we go. There's 5-way election. The other guy whose name I don't remember. There's this 5-way election. Now, if you have 5 people vying for one office, what is the likelihood that the Electoral College has a majority? Almost 0, right? There's no way you're going to have a majority when you have so many candidates to split the vote. And the U.S. Constitution provides for that. If there's no person who wins the majority in the Electoral College, who decides? The House of Representatives. Now, here's the thing. The House is only allowed to choose from the top 3 candidates. And because of his wonderfulness Henry Clay is too good to be in the top 3. He was number 4 after the guy with the stroke. He was number 3. Anyway, Henry Clay ends up number 4, but don't you forget, he has a very powerful position as Speaker of the as Henry Clay, I agree, as Speaker of the House. That means who gets to decide the outcome of this election? That's right. That's right. Henry Clay. So because the third place guy had the stroke and he's like incapacitated, he's not going to be the winner. It's really now comes down to 2 people, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Now technically Andrew Jackson had more popular votes than did John Quincy Adams. More individual people voted for electors to choose Andrew Jackson than did anybody else. But here's the thing, it's not a majority. That means more individual people voted for not Jackson than for Jackson. Does that make sense? So Jackson had the plurality. I'm making these numbers up, but we might say that Jackson had, I don't know, 35% of the popular vote, and maybe Quincy Adams had 30%, and Clay and whatever, and Crawford, and they had the whatever else. So Andrew Jackson had the highest percent of the popular vote, but does he have a majority? No, and so if he only has a plurality, if he just has the most, not a majority, that means 65% of people chose not Jackson, right? Sometimes students are confused, well, why does it go to the House if Jackson had the plurality? Jackson had more than anybody else. The reason is because just because he has more doesn't mean he has a majority. And so like people who wanted not Jackson were in the majority. That's why it goes to the House, because he doesn't have a majority, it has to be decided by the House. So it's going to come down to Jackson and Quincy Adams, and the story is pretty similar to the story that most of you probably know from Hamilton the musical, right? By the way, Henry Clay hates both of them. Clay thinks that Quincy Adams is a spoiled, like, head up his hiney bow, like, just not a good human being, super elitist, doesn't know what it's like to really be a governor, like, has no idea what he's doing. But Clay also thinks that Jackson is like a violent, dangerous demagogue who disrespects constitutional authority and is like a danger to our democracy. Does it sound familiar? Sorry about that. Anyway, so Clay faces this decision between 2 people that he hates. But in the end, he decides to throw his support behind John Quincy Adams, because although he hates both of them, he feels like Quincy Adams is less dangerous. He doesn't like Quincy Adams' politics, but he respects Quincy Adams as a politician. Does that make sense? As opposed to he doesn't respect Jackson at all. In any case, after that, John Quincy Adams is elected by the House of Representatives, becomes president, and then shortly afterwards, Quincy Adams names Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Now, here's the thing. 2 things. First of all, does Henry Clay like John Quincy Adams? Does John Quincy Adams want Henry Clay to be in charge of the House of Representatives during his presidency? No, Quincy Adams is not stupid. He wants to get Henry Clay out of the House of Representatives so that Clay won't be a constant obstacle to his policies, because Clay has so much power in the House. So that's one reason he chose him. The other reason he chose him is because Henry Clay is the best there is. If we want to negotiate with the rest of the world, who better than the world's greatest compromiser? Henry Clay has proven himself time and time again on committee that he is an excellent leader. He will really do well representing our country around the world. So he's an excellent choice. But Jackson says that some corrupt bargain took place, that Quincy Adams and Henry Clay met together behind closed doors, had some shady deal. I'll support you if you give me the Secretary of State's position. And it ruins, well, that's a strong word. People still love Henry Clay, because why wouldn't you? It tarnishes Henry Clay's reputation. Makes him look bad. There is no evidence, not one single scrap of evidence, even in their private diaries, where both Clay and Quincy Adams take meticulous, detailed notes about what they've done, what their motivations are. Neither one of them mention anything about some corrupt bargain. Clay is talking about how much he hates Quincy Adams and how he hates to have to do this, but he feels like he has no choice because Jackson is so dangerous. And Quincy Adams is writing about how Clay is such a thorn in his side, but gosh darn it, if he can't find anybody better for Secretary of State, and how it would be better to have him out of the way anyway so that he won't, get in trouble in the House. But Jackson's story is more important than the reality of Henry Clay's complete innocence. Jackson's story is more important because he's going to repeat the story over and over again for 4 solid years, such that in 1828, Andrew Jackson will soundly defeat John Quincy Adams and become the President of the United States. Henry Clay's worst fear, of course. When Andrew Jackson then enters office, he's going to promise to be a man of the people. He does things like, wait, what's funny? Maybe. He does things like, look, we survived Andrew Jackson, y'all. He does things like promise this idea of rotation in office. He says, look, government isn't for government people. You don't have to be a bureaucrat to know how to run the government. I'm going to invite my regular, everyday old friends, people who supported me in the election. They can have power. The first $1 million ever stolen from the U.S. government was from a Jackson appointee. One of his friends from New York, who was supportive of his campaign, is made the harbor master of New York Harbor, and he proceeds to embezzle more than $1 million of government, what should have been government tax funds. He then runs away, never caught. Anyway, so Jackson's going to promote all these kinds of, it's a spoil system, right? He's going to fill political offices with his friends, despite the fact that they have no qualifications for those offices. On Inauguration Day, he's going to have a big party. It's pretty common, they have big parties on Inauguration Day. But Jackson says, no, I'm not just going to invite my political elite friends. I'm going to invite everyone. All the common people can come to my party. And this, I am required to tell you this story because Mr. Rodriguez remembers nothing else from AP US History. Fun fact, I did not take AP US History. It wasn't offered at my high school. Mr. Rodriguez did, but he did not take the test. He didn't know, I don't know. But he does remember this one story, and it's a true one, so I'll tell it to you. So Andrew Jackson's inauguration, he invites everybody over. All these common people. And the centerpiece of the party is this giant wheel of cheese. Literally, that's all Mr. Rodriguez remembers is a giant wheel of cheese. There's a giant wheel, if you watch The West Wing, it's also mentioned in The West Wing now and then. There's this giant wheel of cheese, and so people can come and carve off a little piece, and there's, of course, free-flowing alcohol all over the place. But so many people come, they're like pouring through the White House, they're like cutting pieces off the carpets and off the paintings like as a souvenir. They steal a whole bunch of like silverware and candlesticks. Andrew Jackson has to escape out of some back room because like the party becomes too wild, so it turns into almost a riot. This is how his first day in office goes down. So anyway, there's that. Nonetheless, congratulations America, you have Andrew Jackson for that. So okay, changing the subject now, let's talk about what happens when Jackson is in office. One of the first things Jackson has to do is deal with a tariff. Remember what's a tariff? A tax on imports, right? Well, just before Jackson entered office, the Congress is trying to sort of screw him up. And so they pass this really high tariff, okay? They pass this really high tariff thinking that it will in some way be a stumbling block for Jackson, because Jackson campaigned on sort of the platform of the common man, right? He's going to be the candidate of the common man. He's going to try to reduce your taxes. He's going to get government out of your business. He's going to whatever. That's Jackson's campaign platform. So this tariff is a really high one. And does Jackson like the northern people? No, those are the Quincy Adams industrialists. He doesn't like them at all. So it seems like Jackson will have to refuse to to enforce this tariff. And in the South, especially people in South Carolina, there's a real sense of anger against the tariff. The tariff of 1828 is perhaps the highest tariff that America had seen yet. It's debatable because like you have to do conversion rates and stuff, but certainly it was one of the highest tariffs America had ever seen. And in South Carolina, there's great anger. Why would the South be particularly opposed to tariffs? Okay, it doesn't benefit them. It doesn't really benefit the West directly either, but it hurts them how? Everyone has to pay higher prices, but the South is hurt extra because if we enact a tariff on British goods, what do the British do? They enact a tariff on our goods. It's called a retaliatory tariff. So the South, which relies on exports, is extra hurt by the tariff in general. And so the South is really angry, and they begin to sort of complain. But here's the thing about Jackson. He can't stand it if people don't do what he says. And here he is, the head of the national government, and he's angry that South Carolina is seeming to suggest they don't have to do what the national government says. So it gets pretty weird. So there's all kinds of disagreement about this. John C. Calhoun, who happens to be Andrew Jackson's vice president, goes back home to South Carolina while still the vice president and presides over a convention where he writes out this sort of manifesto called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. It's 1828. It talks about how terrible the tariff is. It's abuse of the state's rights. The state shouldn't have to follow it. It's a really bad plan. And Jackson is furious. Calhoun is supposed to be his underling. Is supposed to do what he says. is not supposed to make waves. How dare he question the authority of the national government? So at this one really tense dinner, Jackson stands up and he gives a toast to our federal union. It must be preserved. And Calhoun looks at him across the table, stands up, holds his glass up and says, the union, next to our liberty, the most dear. And it's this very public, like, steely moment. By the way, Jackson has literally killed people, okay? So it's not like a joke. They're just glaring at each other. And Calhoun storms off then after the toast, resigns his post as vice president, and goes home to South Carolina, where they begin to form an organization or a protest. In 1832, so after 4 years of working, the tariff is lowered a little bit, but South Carolina is not happy. So John C. Calhoun then chairs something called the Columbia Convention, which occurs in Columbia, South Carolina. A whole bunch of South Carolinians meet. They draft a document that says that they will refuse to abide by the tariff. What is that called when a state says a national law is not valid? Nullification. So they proclaim the doctrine of nullification. We refuse to abide by the tariff. We will nullify this tariff, and we will resist all attempts to collect it. Well, Jackson is, in one word, really grouchy. Okay, he's really angry. He calls up the Navy, sends the Navy to the coast of South Carolina and says, oh, you will pay. Meanwhile, he forces through Congress a bill called the Force Act. The Force Act. And the Force Act is going to give Jackson the power to send the army into South Carolina to forcibly collect the tariff. P.S. Does Jackson even like the tariff, y'all? No, he hates it. He thinks it's stupid. He doesn't want the national government to protect northern industries. But he's so angry that the South and South Carolina wouldn't obey his authority that he's willing to do anything it takes to force this law, to force the inaction of this law. Meanwhile, thank goodness for Henry Clay, because despite the fact that Henry Clay hates Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay loves our country more than he hates Andrew Jackson, and he begins to work on a compromise bill. Okay? He begins to work on a compromise. South Carolina is calling up a volunteer army. This is like Civil War 1.0, right? Like the pre-war, they're gearing up to fight. Henry Clay is, frantically passing this compromise. Finally, the compromise bill is, in fact, passed in 1833 after a year of tense waiting. This tariff it's going to lower the tariff a little bit right off the bat, and then agree to lower the tariff every year automatically until it goes back to the levels of 1827, back to before the tariff abominations. South Carolina accepts it and backs down a little bit, but to make sure that everybody knows that they were serious, the last act of the Columbia Convention is to nullify the Force Act. So they don't disavow nullification. They just say, fine, we'll comply with the tariff, but we nullify the Force Act. You can't send the troops out against us. Jackson is really irritated, but is convinced not to start a civil war over nothingness. So this is the great nullification crisis, and it's really one of the first hints that the South is getting nervous of the powers of Congress. And we'll talk about why that matters tomorrow.